So hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining this expert panel on promoting climate and forest legislation, implementation and governance in Brazil, hosted as part of Climate Law and Governance Day at COP27, which is overall kind of organized by the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. I'd just like to briefly introduce our chair for this session, who is Anna Cárcamo, who is a legal analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative. And Anna will go ahead and introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone, either if you're in Brazil, in Egypt, or anywhere in the world. So I'm personally very pleased to introduce and moderate this panel. Just ask if anyone who has their, their sound on can turn it off. So yes, I'm going back. I'm personally very pleased to introduce and moderate this panel composed only by amazing women from the Global South, in a conference in which most of the negotiators and heads of state are men. So this is especially important. And this panel, it aims to discuss different perspectives on operationalizing the Paris Agreement in Brazil through both legal and governance pathways. As most of you may know, Brazil is one of the current largest global emitters, especially due to deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. And in the past 4 years under the government of Bolsonaro, the institutional governance, law and policy implementation have suffered great setbacks, resulting in a rise of deforestation and in other challenges. And therefore, civil society and subnational governments had to find innovative pathways to implement the Paris Agreement domestically. And this is something that will be in great discussion in this panel. On the other hand, we did have some favorable movements. This year, the Supreme Court, in a move which may definitely enhance climate action, consider the Paris Agreement as having a status above regular legislation, as that is the treatment given to human rights treaties in our country and our constitution. And last month, the elections were held in Brazil, and they brought a renovation of both National Congress, domestic, regional, state congresses, parliaments, also of governors, and of the president. Now, each of the organizations here present will bring a unique pathway in which civil society and subnational governments have been engaging or may engage in operationalizing the Paris Agreement. So I'll pose a brief question to each of our panelists and introduce them and give them around 10 minutes to answer these questions. And then we'll have a discussion between panelists. So first off, for there to be action, there must be access to information. So to that end, let me introduce Caroline Prolo, who is the Executive Director of Latin American Lawyers for Mobilizing Climate Action. So Caroline, to which extent can civil society monitor and have access to reports and documents submitted by parties before the Paris Agreement, and how they can participate in the UNFCCC process, including by submitting information themselves? Thank you so much and welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone in any place of the world you are right now. Well, I'm currently at the COP27, so I apologize if there's too much noise in the background. I'm actually sitting in the corridor. There's a lot of movement around, but hopefully it will go well. Well, I think this is actually one of my favorite parts of the Paris Agreement. It's that its actual backbone is supposed to be its transparency framework. So that parties will be submitting a lot of information about their greenhouse gas emissions, their NDCs, which is the climate pledges, how they are implementing and how they are achieving their NDCs, and also how they are participating in cooperative instruments for implementation. So we will have a lot of information circulating in the Paris Agreement framework, and also a lot of information that will be assessing collective progress on how effective is the Paris Agreement implementation, which is the global stocktake that we'll be discussing in this webinar today. Well, in general, all this information is supposed to be available to be accessed, including, of course, by civil society, either in specific online registries and database, and some of them are already available, such as the NDC registry and many submissions and the submissions from parties and civil society as well. And those that are not yet will at some point be provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So this means that civil society can monitor countries' climate pledges and the information they provide on their level of implementation, and assess these pledges and information, assess the adequacy and integrity of all this information. In certain instances, civil society accredited observers will be able to provide written submissions to these processes. One of such instances is the Article 6.4 supervisory body of the Paris Agreement, which is the body that supervises the new crediting mechanism that somehow replaces the previous Kyoto Protocol clean development mechanism. So in this context of carbon markets, particularly under the cooperative implementation of Article 6, this particular body is trying to welcome civil society's participation. So the meetings of this body, for instance, are open for observers. They actually broadcast in the UNFCCC website, and observers can also submit inputs and even have the opportunity to speak at the end of the meetings. And these inputs are then considered by the supervisory body in each subsequent meeting. So this is a recognition that observers' views are relevant and can even enrich the outcomes of these processes, especially when it comes to more technical matters, where the constituted bodies can certainly learn from the views and experiences of other non-state actors that want to contribute. We can also note in the recent years that the UNFCCC negotiations process has been more understanding and welcoming of the concerns of civil society, in the sense that most negotiations meetings that used to be closed for observers are now open for observers. And the ones in a more formal setting, like contact groups, even allow statements by observers in the end. And of course, other than that, I'm sure you already, some of you perhaps already noticed that these meetings are now broadcast online. So this means that people in the entire world can follow this decision-making process very closely. You don't have to go to a COP, and you can save some carbon emissions by staying at home and following the informal consultations online. As again, meetings that used to be closed for observers are now not only open, as they are already broadcast online. So this is, I think, these are very relevant developments that we have had in the past years to ensure more transparency and more openness of the process for civil society, so that they can participate in these processes. We also have the global stocktake. Again, I will not cover this because our colleague Marina will cover this much better than I could possibly try. But I think in general, this process for transparency and participation of civil society is a major achievement, and I think it's only just beginning. I think this will be much more improved along the way. I think this is a trend, and it will be improved eventually as we realize that this is cooperation at its best, which is, I think, personally all that we need to effectively address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Yes, it's wonderful to see how this process of the UNFCCC, as you mentioned, and the Article 6 supervisory body are actually becoming so much more open and transparent. And hopefully these are also practices that we can reproduce in Brazil with governance and policy. And we can also use this experience to see how Brazil is positioning itself in the international negotiations, so we can also then demand as civil society for better actions. So yes, thank you. And now moving on to Brazil, as mentioned, there were elections in the legislative for both the state and the National Congress. And Beatriz Pagi is the executive secretary of Clima de Eleição, which is an organization that works with capacity building and also training and mapping of these legislative personnel. And so, Beatriz, according to Clima de Eleição, does the composition of the Brazilian legislative in the federal and state levels promote climate action? And are there possibilities for vertical integration and cooperation that you've seen? Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. Just to reinforce, I'm the executive director of Clima de Eleição, which is an advocacy organization here in Brazil. We are a nonprofit and super party organization, and we have been engaging throughout the election since 2020. So it's not our first election that we are trying to influence candidates and elected representatives. So we have been following this very closely. And although we have the results for over a month now, we're still living a transition period. So we do have the numbers of people who are assuming the chairs, but these might change when the new government assumes. And when there is allocation of current representatives that are elected in the executive power, for example, people who would be their vice chair would assume the position. So we still don't have the final look at this. But we can say that this election was highly influenced by this maneuver of the current government, the current Bolsonaro government, with many different strategies and tactics that definitely lowered the isonomy of the final result. So this not only influenced the executive power result, but also the legislative power in both federal and state levels. And what we can say is that in the deputy chamber, our National Congress, 4 of the parties supporting Bolsonaro occupy half of the chairs. So this is a very serious situation that regardless of how well our future president Lula is going to handle things, we do have a challenging scenario for him to basically navigate the whole situation and have to put his best diplomatic and negotiation skills to practice. So, however, those parties, they are not necessarily aligned ideologically with Bolsonaro or Lula. We do have a strong center, which is the majority of people have always been, and they are always swindling depending on what's the position of the government and how well these negotiations internally happen. So they are more interested in power and resources, and they can exchange this for governability. So that's something that we are going to see happening, that has always been happening in our current government structure. And in terms of the regional level, for the Amazon specifically, since we are talking about deforestation, we can see that we had very negative results. We had very few people aligned with the agenda that were elected. And we see that key representatives that were pushing for this agenda were not re-elected. And we can comment, specifically highlight Joênia Wapichana, who was the first indigenous woman and leader to be elected, and she was not re-elected. Unfortunately, we had this huge surge of people that were voting against the climate agenda, environmental and social agendas. We can also see that these could be mitigated with some new representatives. So we see that there is more and more interest of the Brazilian population in politics. We see this movement of people being more aware. And we elected some very iconic and key people. So for example, it was the first time that we elected 2 trans women that are very aligned to human rights. And we also elected 2 indigenous women. So although Joênia was not re-elected, we did elect Sônia Guajajara and Célia Chacriabá to the Congress, which is twice as many indigenous people represented in the Congress. So this is positive news, but it's still a very difficult situation. So Lula has been putting the climate agenda in the center of his discourse, of the whole narrative, and this is very good, but we do have to keep pushing for it. He does have this historical articulation capacity, and we can see that the transition team is pretty confident about this in all his narratives and what he's putting outside for people to see. But in general, the progressists are the minority. And we see this being reflected in the state level as well, in the regional level. There is a minority of federal states which are aligned with him, and we have very small number of representations that are explicitly climate friendly and climate engaged. And in terms of vertical integration, that's something that we have to make happen. Even if this is not given to us, this is something that we have to make this happen. And we can see that during the last 4 years, a lot of protagonism from the other representatives in other levels happened. So we can mention the mayors that were putting forward climate action plans with the support of other networks such as C40. We can see 6 major capital cities doing that, and even non-capital cities. So for example, we have the 4 C40 cities, that's São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and Curitiba, all have climate action plans, and now they have to be implemented. So that's something that happened very recently. Most of them were published last year or the year before. And we also have other cities like Recife and Fortaleza who also have these kind of plans. But that's a very costly process, and that's something that we need more support and more technical capacity for subnational governments to actually implement. So it's not all of them. And we have over 5,000 municipalities. So not all the 5,000 are going to have the resources and the knowledge to actually push this forward. However, we also have in the regional level the governors that are engaged with climate as well. They created this network during the last 4 years, and they have been pushing for this kind of ambition. So hopefully now they will be aligned with the federal government, and we can have these coherent plans instead of having them pushing against the setbacks. So that will also require a lot of articulation, like I just mentioned, but hopefully our future government will have this kind of capacity and will be able to bring this all into a more stable situation. And in terms of what we have been doing, I think that civil society will have to play a huge role in all of this with advocacy and pressuring. We know that the last few years were, in a way, necessary for the civil society organizations, movements, coalitions to be strengthened. And this made us really articulate ourselves since we were not in a comfortable position. And through Clima de Eleição, we have been working with over 1,000 parliamentarians in all these 3 levels of government here in Brazil. And we want to keep focusing on strengthening them and giving them the tools, and also connecting them with people who are in the front lines to make these new policies as participatory as possible. So that would be the opportunities that I see in terms of the election results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. It's wonderful to hear about the work of Clima de Eleição and the opportunities for civil society to engage with this, the current scenario for the legislative and the executive powers. Even though the results were mixed, as you mentioned, there are some positive opportunities still for there to keep being collaboration and integration towards effective implementation and coherent legislation and policies. So thank you so much. And now I see Marina has joined us. So Now I'll move on to how can we discuss about the how can civil society contribute to the intergovernmental process and keep checks on Brazil, so connecting the international sphere with the domestic sphere. So please welcome Marina Marçal, who is the coordinator of climate policy at the Institute for Climate and Society, ICS. And Marina, how can non-state actors in Brazil contribute to the global stocktake to keep operationalizing the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry for the delay. We all know the connection here in the COP27 is not easy. But I think this is a great panel. This is a great opportunity for us to be thinking about how we can advance with transparency and monitoring in Brazil, and how we can learn with this process of global stocktake to have a process more clear, how we can advance with public data. And I think this is the kind of contribution that non-state actors can have. They can put pressure for our, not only the federal government, but also the governors and the mayors advance with implementation and advance especially with transparency. And so civil society can be monitoring how far we are from the targets that our public actors assume, especially considering how they compromise in the COPs, and how far we are or not from the 1.5 degrees. I think this process is very important for us to be advancing forward with ambitious that is related with the sense of urgency that we have in this decade, and also to understand if the compromises that our public sector are having, and also the private sector, is enough to deal with this crisis. I think it's very important to have civil society involved in this process, so can put out this pressure. And I think that dealing with the private sector, considering that, I think the joy of global stocktake is that they are also involving non-party stakeholders. So we have the chance to be involved in the private sector to do not have greenwashing, to show exactly what they are doing to move forward with the implementation when they come for a space like COP and other national, international conferences, promising that they will be net zero. To become net zero, we have many other steps before that. So it would be great to see these intermediary actions, really actions in a COP of implementation before we can wake up in 2050 and see that these efforts were not enough. So I think to have this mechanism of transparency, that is global stocktake, looking for mitigation, adaptation, but also finance, is very important. So Brazil have a chance, especially now, have a chance to be getting more close with the international community. We can use with the international cooperation to advance with technology, because we are always listening that Brazil wants finance in other countries in development, but we need to add finance for what? I think if this finance is for technology to advance with public data and transparency, that would be great. I had an experience this year while I was doing part of my PhD in Colombia. Michael Gerard in the course could see the Mardi Gras in New Orleans, how many of methane that the city was emitting in real time. And I felt like, wow, I really would like to advance with public data in this level in Brazil. And it's interesting because we do have the same satellites in Brazil. So it means that we just need to advance with public data. I'm very happy because Observatorio do Clima, which I have the chance to support, and the work that Tasso Azevedo is doing with the system of emissions, is now advancing to have public data about methane. But this is a work from civil society that's supposed to be from the federal government. So I really hope that, as our colleagues were saying before, we can advance with stronger climate governance and more structures, so civil society can play this role of watchdog in a better way, and our federal government can come for the COPs asking for finance with a very defined proposal to advance technology as for us have more ambitious targets and see how we can really move forward the implementation of our NDC. And I hope the next NDC can come back with the sectoral targets, but also have a sense of the emergency that this crisis is giving for us. We really need to move forward with that.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you for being able to connect in COP. And you and Caroline have been able to connect despite the challenges there. So we're very grateful that you were able to join. And definitely, it's very important to highlight this importance of transparency, of civil society keeping track of what is being negotiated, but also what's being implemented domestically, and putting pressure, especially for what you've mentioned, more transparency, more public data. This is something that we've also seen a lot in our work in CPI, is the necessity of transparency and of public data, so that we can keep track of the finance flows and of the other kinds of implementations of policies. And to that end, now I'll move on to Joana Chiavari, who's the Associate Director of Law and Governance at the Climate Policy Initiative in Brazil. So Joana, as we mentioned, the biggest source of Brazilian emissions is land use change and deforestation. And we do have a national policy on that, a national law called the Forest Code, which can implement the Paris Agreement. But what are the main challenges and possibilities in its implementation? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Climate Law and Governance Day for this event. And I would also like to compliment my colleagues in the panel for their excellent presentation. My focus on this panel is connecting the Paris Agreement to a domestic policy in Brazil and addressing some of the key challenges. And I'd like to start by focusing on Brazil's emission patterns, which are very different from those in other countries. The most critical areas responsible for the greatest share of Brazil's emissions are land use change and agriculture. Based on 2021 data, land use change, and forestry is the great villain, responsible for almost 50% of Brazil's emissions, while agriculture represents the second largest contributor, being responsible for 25%. So this means that Brazil's climate goals should focus on protecting Brazil's natural land from further deforestation, and also aim to restore forested areas that have been cleared. Then when we look at Brazil's NDC, its first NDC was presented in 2015 and then further submitted in 2016, and it included sectoral commitments which are related to land use. These commitments were first to enforce the implementation of the Forest Code, second to achieve zero illegal deforestation by 2030 in the Brazilian Amazon and compensate for greenhouse gases emissions from legal suppression of vegetation by 2030. Third, to restore and reforest 12 million hectares of forests by 2030. And then finally, fourth, to enhance sustainable native forest management systems. However, since then, Brazil has updated its NDC targets twice. It presented a second NDC in 2020 and then a reviewed version in 2022. Unfortunately, both submissions, there was a weakening in the commitments made, allowing for higher emissions than in Brazil's first submission. But in particular importance for this discussion today, there was an exclusion of reference to the implementation of sectoral mitigation actions, such as the enforcement of the forest code and the illegal deforestation in 2030, the restoration commitments, and so on. So the omission of sectoral goals make the reviewed Brazil's NDC sound like some vague and some unfocused proposals, and also make it extremely difficult to connect domestic policies to the country's commitments under the Paris Agreement. Therefore, it is important for Brazil's future NDC to adopt clarity in communicating sectoral goals and the respective measures. This would facilitate the monitoring of the NDC implementation and also its improvement, ensuring that there is an increase in ambition according to the Paris Agreement. And it would also facilitate the engagement of various actors from society in the process of planning of a new NDC and participating in consultations. So moving now to the domestic level, when we look at Brazil's land use policies, we see a comprehensive and rather refined conservation policy architecture. But among Brazil's land use policies, the Forest Code is a crucial instrument. Besides helping the country to reach its climate targets, the implementation of the Forest Code can also have a key role in inducing green economic growth by inducing a more productive use of the country's land. But merely from a climate perspective, the Forest Code contributes to meeting the country's mitigation goals through 6 typologies of instruments. First, it includes instruments that help protecting native vegetation. Second, it includes instruments which contribute to the monitoring and controlling of deforestation. Third, it includes instruments which require compensation for legal deforestation. Fourth, instruments that contribute to restoration of deforested areas. Fifth, instruments that contribute to sustainable native forest management systems. And finally, it includes economic instruments that contribute to conservation and forest restoration. I'm going to provide some examples of how such instruments work and how they are aligned with Brazil's climate goals. So first of all, the Forest Code, it helps protecting native vegetation within private lands through 2 types of protection instruments: permanent preservation areas and legal forest reserve. I'm going to explain the concept of legal forest reserve, which is a requirement for rural landowners to set aside a percentage of their property area with native vegetation. And this protected percentage may vary from 20 to 80%. An example of how the Forest Code contributes to the monitoring and controlling of deforestation is by establishing the Rural Environmental Registry, also known as CAR, which is a database and an environmental management tool that provides a way to monitor and control the deforestation in private land holdings, because the code requires that every rural property be registered in this registry. Another way to show how the Forest Code requires compensation for legal deforestation, it's by setting conditions for the legal deforestation of unprotected areas, for instance, requiring reforestation as compensation for the vegetation lost. And finally, the Forest Code, it contributes to restoration of deforested areas by requiring all landowners to restore illegal deforested areas on their properties through their enrollment in the environmental regularization program. So despite the promising of vast and potential benefits for Brazil implementing the law, its actual implementation remains a major challenge, even after 10 years it's entering into force. And the challenges to the Forest Code implementation, they can have different dimensions. So first of all, there is an individual dimension. because one of the biggest challenge of the Forest Code is its dependency on the individual actions of landholders. We have individuals of approximately 5.3 million properties, which are expected to initiate the process of environmental compliance. But many of them lack the information, the capacity, or the resources they need to do so. Secondly, there is an institutional dimension, which involves the government's challenges. The Forest Code is a federal law whose implementation needs to occur across all Brazilian states, involving 27 different governments with specific legislative instruments and contrasting realities. There is also the necessity of a dialogue and coordination that needs to take place between the states and the federal level. So in terms of these challenges, a third dimension would be the legal dimension, which is related to the regulatory and the judicial challenges. The political pressure to weakening the law at the federal level and the legal discussions at different levels of the Brazilian courts have continuously delayed the application of the Forest Code main instruments. And finally, there is an economic dimension involving finance and market challenges, because rural producers complain about the high cost of compliance with the Forest Code. For instance, the cost of restoration and the access to programs which offer lower interest rates is still limited, and mechanisms such as the payment for environmental services remain a promise that is still unfulfilled and that have not been rolled out at scale. So moving to my conclusions, despite the challenges to fully implement the Forest Code in the country, it is possible to observe progress at the state level. But the application of its instruments has evolved very unequally among the states. Therefore, monitoring progress made so far is crucial to identify successful strategies adopted that could be scaled and replicated to ensure that this law is effectively adopted, promoting a widespread regularization of the country's rural areas and contributing to meeting Brazil's climate goal. This is because at CPI's Brazil office, we permanently monitor the implementation of the Forest Code in all Brazilian states and publish annual reports, which are publicly available, where we measure progress and we highlight the challenges, the strategies, and the opportunities to accelerate the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joana. It's so interesting to hear about all the opportunities, but also challenges that we have in implementing the forest agenda in Brazil. It's especially interesting to highlight how you mentioned that the NDC in Brazil used to have sectoral measures and now does not, and how that is something that needs to be remediated in our upcoming NDC, since that is, of course, our biggest challenge in the country. But also very important to hear about the possibilities that the Forest Code brings, but also its challenges, especially in the legal dimension, the governance challenges, the dependency on the individual actions, but also the economic challenges that need to be overcome. So thank you so much for bringing that to light. And also, of course, having this constant follow-up and transparency on how it's being implemented, which is very important. So now I'd like to pose a question for all of the panelists, a brief question which some of you have already touched upon. And I'd ask if you can answer quite quickly in up to 2 minutes. Well, as was mentioned, we had the presidential elections this year, and the elected president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was already president twice, was celebrated worldwide as a win for climate action, since even in his speech, he mentioned repositioning Brazil as a global leader for climate action. How do you believe that this can shift the role for civil society and subnational governments in Brazil, specifically regarding the strategies that you mentioned? How can they be enhanced and potentialized with this new government? And you can answer in the order that you spoke, or however you prefer. Thank you.
Well, I think I can start with that. Well, definitely this is it seems to be a new beginning for Brazil, a new beginning, now that we are not, we don't have a history with climate change and with climate change national policies, but definitely we had a difficult time in this previous administration. So now we need to begin again in the way that we engage with the international negotiations and how we implement them domestically. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to consider two things. I guess one of them is to revise our NDC, which, as was mentioned before, is clearly not only unambitious, but is also going backwards in terms of progressing on ambition. So we have the opportunity to do that now, but we also have to have a process in place for doing this continuously, because NDCs have to be renewed each 5 years. So I think we should perhaps use this opportunity to make our president, maybe, I don't know if this can be made in an executive decree or something, but we definitely need a process for the subsequent reviews of our NDCs. We need a participatory process. We need a process that consults civil society, that consults our scientists in Brazil. We have so many good scientists. We have a database for as Joanna mentioned, we do have the information to understand what are our emissions levels and what are our issues in terms of emission sources. So we can discuss this together in an inclusive manner, but we need a process, a clear process that has to be incorporated in a normative act, so that we can all be sure of how this is going to happen. So that's my input for now on this important issue.
Maybe I can complement something. Yes, I just wanted to add that from 2004 to 2012, while we have the previous Lula's presidency, Brazil played a successful role in reducing emissions due to the nation's progress in curbing deforestation by 80%. And this was mainly due to increased monitoring through satellite system and to better law enforcement. So, and then land use change and forestry emissions started trending back upwards after 2012, but they accelerated in 2019. So we have a successful policy experience that was aligned with Lula's previous government. And we also have the academic knowledge that was produced confirming the impact of those policies that were implemented to protect native vegetation and that can be applied. So we have a roadmap which we expect that we can follow. But something that was very, I think, clear from our recent experience is the importance of political leadership and commitment to the agenda, how key this is for the process. And also the example that we had about the possibility of a systematic dismantling of the capacity of environmental agencies that are so important for this agenda. So these are, I think, some key issues of expectation under this new government.
Thank you so much both for highlighting these very important issues, both having more public participation in the development of our new NDCs and the need of leadership in implementing the measures to combat deforestation and having strong institutions, of course. And if none of the other panelists have a comment to make, I'd like to to read one of the questions that was made in our Q&A. Oh, sorry, Joanna.
No, I think Bia.
Oh, of course. Please,
Yes.
Bia.
Yeah, I wanted to comment that a different aspect from this transition is that it's great that we have this perspective of having an open dialogue. This was completely destroyed during the last government. We had a new norm that the Bolsonaro government issued that most of the participatory spaces and forums were dismantled, like Joanna mentioned. But now we can see this perspective of reopening them or giving them more substance. But at the same time, a lot of really high capacity scientists and people, representatives from civil society, are probably going to transition to this new government. They will be appointed or nominated to these positions, which is fantastic in terms of collaboration. But at the same time, us that remain in the civil society side and NGOs and so forth, we have this extra layer of challenge of demanding people that were our allies to push for more ambition. So this might create some uncomfort, but some discomfort there, but we still have, it's great. It's like a trade-off. We lose really good people from the NGOs and go to the government, but at the same time, we have to demand them. Yep.
Yes, thank you so much, Bia, for highlighting this issue as well. The issue of all the collegiate bodies, the collaborative bodies being removed from this government by decree was definitely a huge situation for lack of public participation and transparency, which, as you mentioned, will hopefully be overturned, but also, of course, being aware of the challenges that the new government might also pose, as you mentioned, with people from civil society moving to government and the change in relationships, and also being aware to avoid friendly fire, as we say. So thank you so much for this comment. Marina, do you have anything you want to mention as well? Okay, so I'll move on to questions from our discussants. So Carolina Garrido, who's here present with us, is researcher at the Research Group on Law, Environment, and Justice in the Anthropocene from JUMA and PUC-Rio. And Cristina Leme Lopes is a lawyer and researcher in Brazil as well. I'd ask Carolina if she can make her questions, and then I'll read the questions that Cristina posed in our Q&A box, and I'd ask all of the panelists to respond them as much as you want to, and then also make your final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if we should let Marina add to the former question first. I see she has the hand raised.
Yes, of course. Please, Marina.
Sorry about the delay, but if I have something to complement, I really think that the parliamentarians, they can play a role very strategic for implementation, because once they understand the power of local level to move forward with the implementation, they can create local laws, the state level and also municipalities, which JUMA, CPI works a lot, that can help the compromises that Brazil assume internationally. So how can the local laws can help Brazil to move forward the implementation, and how the local laws also put us far from the targets that we assume in these conferences. And that's why I also support the parliamentarian environmental front. I think it's very strategic to be close to them and to promote public hearings, to discuss topics that can be a challenge and that different sectors have different views about being good for climate or not. And also to connect the National Congress with the laws in the states and municipal level, especially considering as a lawyer the competences. So when we are talking about transport, of course we need to we need to work close with the mayor, but would be very strategic to be talking with the consuls and the state deputies. So I really think parliamentarians can play a role very strategic also to help us to moving forward the transparency, monitoring, but advance with implementation. That's it.
Thank you so much, Marina, for highlighting the importance of the power of the local levels and laws and the coordination between the different levels. So now I just hand over to Carolina to make a brief question to all panelists. And then I think according to the time, we unfortunately won't be able to answer the questions in the Q&A. So I'd ask all the panelists to also, when they respond to this question, however they feel is better regarding their points or their topics, if they can also have their final words. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll join on in thanking all the splendid panelists, all women from Brazil that we're really proud of. And well, one of the main interests of our group, as Anna mentioned, is climate justice. And climate justice movement shows us that the effects of the climate crisis are not experienced in a democratic way, and that social vulnerabilities influence in how different groups are impacted. So I would like to ask all the panelists, and I'm sorry about the but what measures can be taken, and this in the international level, in the domestic level, in regional level, to address this and take into account these different impacts, and also how to try to assure participation, not only from the civil society, but especially from these most affected groups. Thank you.
I'll start again. Well, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm going to try to address this point from an international and if I may, from a climate litigation perspective. Well, firstly, from an international perspective, I'm very happy that we are in this historic moment where, for the first time, we are having an honest conversation about financing loss and damage. However, this may be framed as a compensation or finance or insuring or any word you might like, but at least at the same time we are facing this elephant in the room, which is the fact that certain people, certain communities and countries are unjustly suffering the most of this climate crisis. And in the past 30 years, we were never able to address their very serious losses and damages. So I think there are good expectations around that. Of course, this is probably a long way to go until we have something very explicitly designed and operational, of course. But I guess let's start with hope in this conversation, and then move into another perspective of, you know, when things don't work out well, which is going to the courts. And I think we are also in a historic moment where we are seeing lots of cases being brought by young people, you know, by the future generations that are going also to inherit this very unfair situation, this unfair burden. And we are seeing that the courts are responding well to this. Of course, this is again a moving target, but I think there is hope for that. And that's when I come back to my first comment on the fact that we have a transparent system now in the Paris Agreement that will provide a lot of information that can be used in these litigation cases being brought by the future generations and other vulnerable actors that are suffering the most of climate change.
Thank you so much, Carolina. It's so important to hear also from this angle of litigation and the importance of the role of youth and engaging in these movements as well. I'd ask if the other panelists also have anything to add to this question.
I think it all goes back to civic participation and how effective can we make this? How effective can we integrate those different levels? Because even if you have a lot of narratives and discourses in the international level, we definitely need to do this in the subnational level, especially when we talk about loss and damage and adaptation. All of these is more effective when it happens on the ground, when we have locally led adaptation initiatives, and when those communities can actually understand what's happening with them and attribute the correct tags, and they have direct access to finances, and they have also direct access to this knowledge and implementation tools. So this is something that I would always put when we take climate justice into consideration. It's very hard for us to empower these people. Actually, we don't need to empower these people. We need to just give them the platforms. Many times they are already doing amazing adaptation work, but they don't have the visibility and the spotlight. People are just trying to survive, and many times these survival techniques are not even taken into consideration. So we have to first switch the logic of top-down or bottom-up approach. I think we are in a all the above situation right now with the climate crisis. We need policies, we need the international commitments, but we also need to elevate what's happening on ground. And to assure this participation, the main issue is that our system, our political participation system, is created based on colonization still. And it's tailored for people not to feel empowered to actually take ownership of that. And that happens in the multiple levels. It happens in terms of COP, for it being a very exclusive and limited event. And even if we wanted, we wouldn't be able to take everyone to COP. There is no physical space enough to hold all these people. But we can strengthen networks and strengthen new movements to send representatives at least, and to put more finances on their hands so they can be heard and they can participate. And on the other hand, we also need to, in the subnational level, people don't take ownership of the parliamentary houses. Many of us have never even entered these buildings at least once. So we have to understand that this is not given to us. We have to still push for it and create this, be non-conformative and to push for it, but also understand that this is an exclusive, very exclusive and excludent process, and it was not made for us. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bia, for addressing these underlying and structural issues that also create difficulties towards climate justice. I see Marina has her hand up.
Okay, so first I would like to say that we are going to host an event soon in the Brazil Climate Action Hub, which we're going to have the transmission online and also the translation, English and Portuguese, and it will be with the Dr. Robert Bullard, which is a sociologist and considered the father of environmental racism concept. I was with him these days. I helped him to create the Climate Justice Pavilion, and I will be with him soon. That's why I need to jump for this meeting, but I would like to invite you that make the question to be watching the panel. And I wrote actually this week in the news about this concept, how we can learn with it. And back to your question, Dr. Bullard and other people, they are in the advisory board of environmental agenda for the White House. They will be with the president by the year soon. They have a reception together later. And this is something that we have been talking a lot. How can Brazil, which have, for example, 5 to 6% of the population Black, but other countries, moving forward with climate governance that can be more inclusive? In Brazil, for example, we are talking about to create a position of a Secretary of Climate like US with Biden government create for John Kerry. And he also created a advisory board of environmental specialists, which is very inclusive. It also includes Dr. Peggy Shepard and Dr. Beverly Rice. So many Black people, they can be close to the federal level, that can be influencing the ones they are creating the public policy for climate, that in a way it could be more inclusive and looking for equity and bringing the voices of the people in the territories that can show how they already experience the climate change in their territories. So I definitely hope that this new governance of climate in Brazil, they create a Secretary of Climate. They have a person for that, but also that we can create advisory boards for different agendas. For example, the criminal agenda, the mass incarceraments, many others that can listen, Black people that can listen, the most affected, to be creating public policies that listen to these voices and address solutions considering their problems. So I think it's not only for climate justice, it happens with many other agendas. And again, I would like to reinforce my invitation because we also gonna have the Queen of Congo, which speak English and Portuguese and have been in Brazil. And we were yesterday talking about these analogies, the similarities of the countries in the African diaspora suffering of the same issues. So we should be looking for global, uh, uh, just global problems together, but how to address local solutions for the same problems. Thank you, Ana. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you all for inviting me. I really need to go, and I think this panel was such an honor and very important in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina. I'll definitely reinforce the invitation that she made for all to watch this event in the Brazil Action Hub, which is also available online. And as she mentioned, Dr. Robert Bullard is an impressive father of the environmental justice movement in the United States, and which also brought repercussions through the whole world. So it'll definitely be a very important panel. And I definitely would second her comment about there being a Secretary of Climate in Brazil, and perhaps even there are other policies in the United States which could be serve as examples, such as the environmental justice policy. I think it's a policy act, an executive order actually from the Clinton government. So it has been a long time ago, but it's still very much needed and could be a very important reference. So now I'd also ask Joanna to answer another question that we received in our Q&A. Also, of course, if she wants to answer the question made from Carolina, which was made from Cristina Leme. So first, because it's very relevant to the topic that you brought about the forest code. So beyond the forest code, what measures are needed to prevent illegal deforestation, and what are the challenges and pathways towards them? And regarding the Paris Agreement, do you find the financial and economic mechanisms sufficient to protect the forest and deter deforestation in Brazil? And then I'd ask for your final words, as unfortunately we only have 5 minutes left for this panel. And also already thanking all the panelists for this brilliant panel. It's been an honor to moderate you. Thank you.
I'll be brief, but I think the first question about illegal deforestation, I will address also a question in the Q&A that talks about other illegal activities and corruption that we also see accompanying illegal deforestation in the Amazon. And I just wanted to clarify that according to Brazil's policy landscape, the forest code, it is designed to promote forest conservation in private lands. Then we have other policies in Brazil that are focused on protecting public lands. However, without monitoring law enforcement and accountability for environmental crimes and infractions, the conservation policies and the progress may languish. So we really need to complement this command with the control that comes with this sort of policies. And this is exactly the kind of initiatives that were part of a program that we call PPCDAM, which is an action plan for prevention and control of deforestation in the legal Amazon, which was set up in 2004. And then under the current administration, it was dismantled, but that it had a lot of success in curbing deforestation because it integrated actions across different government institutions and introduced innovative procedures for monitoring, for environmental control, and also for the territorial management. And there were other policies that were enacted, which also had an important impact. But I think that one important lesson is really how to complement within the policy architecture to make sure that we can address these issues.
Okay, thank you so much, Joanna. Sorry, were you going to add anything else? Okay, thank you so much. It's so important to highlight the success case of the PPCDAM, which hopefully we can implement again and even go beyond what was already achieved. And I'd like to thank again all of our amazing panelists. It was such an honor to hear from Caroline about how civil society can access more information, and from Marina about how civil society can contribute to the global stocktake, among other points. From Beatriz about how the current legislative is shaping up and the challenges and potentials there. And finally, from Joanna about how the Forest Code is being implemented and other possibilities and potentials and challenges for climate action domestically. It was amazing to be in this panel, to moderate this panel. I learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. And I hope we can continue this conversation after. Thank you so much.